The 17th of January 1944. Stalag Luft 3, Sagan, Lower Silesia. The air inside the wooden barracks smelled of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Beyond the double barbed wire fence, snow blanketed the Prussian plain in silence so complete that even breath seemed forbidden. In the corner of Block 104, a man sat on a crude bunk, his hands trembling not from cold but from memory. His name was Flight Lieutenant Charles Rawlings, Royal Air Force, shot down over Hamburg 3 weeks prior. His wrists bore the purple bruises of interrogation, his ribs fractured. His voice, somehow, still carried the melody of "It's a long way to Tipperary" whenever the guards passed close enough to hear. This was not defiance born of training. This was defiance born of something the Reich had not calculated in its meticulous plans for domination, the stubborn, irrational resilience of men who had tasted freedom and refused to forget its flavor. Rawlings had been tortured for 6 consecutive days in a Gestapo facility outside Berlin. They had beaten him with rubber truncheons. They had submerged his head in ice water until his lungs screamed. They had played recordings of his wife's voice, intercepted from Red Cross letters, twisted into fabricated pleas for him to cooperate. And through it all, he sang, not loudly, not triumphantly, but steadily, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. The Gestapo had a word for men like Rawlings' Terrorfliegen, terror flyers. It was a designation that stripped Allied airmen of their status as prisoners of war, rendering them subject to summary execution or indefinite torture under Heinrich Himmler's directives. By the winter of 1944, the Nazi war machine had grown desperate. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than training schools could replace them. American bombers turned German cities into ash fields nightly, and the myth of Aryan invincibility was crumbling under the weight of Soviet offensives in the east. In this context, men like Rawlings were not merely prisoners. They were psychological battlegrounds. Breaking them meant breaking the morale of the Allied bombing campaign. It meant proving that democracy's warriors were fundamentally weak, that their individualism would collapse under the discipline of the totalitarian will. But Charles Rawlings did not break, and in refusing to break, he became something far more dangerous to the Reich than a bomber pilot. He became a symbol. The history of Stalag Luft III is inseparable from the history of human ingenuity under constraint. Built in 1942 specifically to house captured Allied airmen, the camp was designed by the Luftwaffe to be escape-proof. The barracks sat 5 feet above ground on stilts, making tunneling visible. Seismograph microphones buried around the perimeter detected underground vibrations. Guard towers, equipped with searchlights and machine guns, overlooked every square meter. The sandy soil chosen deliberately collapsed easily, suffocating would-be escapers. And yet, by January 1944, 3 separate tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, were already under construction, dug by prisoners using stolen spoons, bed slats, and tin cans. Rawlings arrived at Stalag Luft 3 on the 10th of January 1944, transferred from the Gestapo facility after his interrogators concluded he possessed no actionable intelligence. His body was a catalogue of trauma. His mind, however, remained sharp. Within hours of his arrival, he was approached by squadron leader Roger Bushell, the South African-born RAF officer who led the camp's escape committee. Bushell, known as Big X, was orchestrating what would become the largest prisoner breakout of the Second World War. He needed men who understood discipline, who could endure hardship without complaint, who had already proven their capacity for resistance. Rawlings, still humming fragments of forgotten songs, fit the profile perfectly. But first, Bushell needed to hear Rawlings' story. Not the sanitized version. The truth. And so, in a corner of the barracks where acoustics muffled conversation, Rawlings spoke. The Gestapo facility was located in a repurposed brewery outside Charlottenburg. Rawlings remembered the smell, stale hops, mixed with disinfectant and fear. He was held in a basement cell with a single bulb that never turned off. The interrogations began on the first day. A Gestapo officer named Sturmbannführer Klaus Heinz conducted them. Heinz was a former schoolteacher from Leipzig, a man who had joined the SS in 1936 because it promised authority he had never wielded in civilian life. He spoke fluent English, acquired during a year teaching in Manchester before the war. He used that fluency like a scalpel. Heinz's first question was simple. What were your targets in Hamburg? Rollings, following protocol, responded with name, rank, and serial number. Heinz smiled. You misunderstand your situation, Lieutenant. You are not a prisoner of war. You are a war criminal. The Führer has declared that Allied airmen who bomb civilian populations forfeit the protections of Geneva. You exist here at my discretion. The first blow came without warning, a rubber truncheon across the kidneys. Rollings collapsed, gasping. Heinz waited until he struggled back to his knees, then repeated the question. Again, Rollings gave name, rank, serial number. Again, the truncheon fell. This pattern continued for 3 hours. By the end, Rollings could not stand without assistance. His urine was dark with blood. On the second day, Heinz changed tactics. He brought a gramophone into the interrogation room and played a recording of Vera Lynn singing "We'll Meet Again." He explained that this song was popular among British soldiers who believed they would return home victorious. He asked Rollings if he truly believed that. Rollings, through cracked lips, said nothing. Heinz nodded to an assistant, who brought a bucket of ice water. They held Rollings' head under until his vision blackened. When they pulled him up, Heinz asked again. Rollings, coughing water, began to sing "We'll Meet Again" himself, off-key and broken, but unmistakable. Heinz's face flushed red. He struck Rollings across the jaw, dislocating it. Yet even with his jaw hanging askew, Rollings continued to hum the melody through clenched teeth. It was an act of such absurd, reckless defiance that even the guards seemed unsettled. Heinz ordered him returned to his cell. On the third day, they played the recording of his wife's voice. It was a Red Cross letter, read aloud, in which she described their daughter's 3rd birthday. The Gestapo had edited the recording, splicing in a fabricated plea. Charles, please, just tell them what they want to know. I can't bear this anymore. The voice was hers, but the words were not. Rollings knew this immediately. His wife was a nurse, trained to maintain composure under stress. She would never beg, but hearing her voice, twisted into a weapon, broke something inside him nonetheless. He wept. And then, through tears, he began to sing "Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag," a marching song from the First World War. His voice cracked, his pitch wavered, but he sang. Heinz stood abruptly and left the room. He did not return for the remainder of the day. On the 4th day, Rollings was beaten with fists and boots. On the 5th, they broke 2 of his ribs with a wooden club. On the 6th, Heinz entered the cell and sat across from him in silence for 20 minutes. Then he said quietly, "You will die here, Lieutenant. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. And no one will remember your name." Rollings, barely conscious, replied, "Then I'll die singing." Heinz stood, walked to the door, and paused. "You British," he said, almost wonderingly, "you are either the bravest men I have ever met, or the most foolish." The next morning, Rollings was transferred to Stalag Luft 3. Roger Bushell listened to this account without interruption. When Rollings finished, Bushell was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You'll do." The Great Escape, as it would come to be known, was not a spontaneous act of desperation. It was an industrial operation conducted in impossible conditions. 3 tunnels, each over 300 feet long, dug through collapsing sand, a ventilation system constructed from tin cans and stolen piping, electric lighting powered by siphoned camp electricity, forged identity papers produced by an underground print shop using carved soap stamps and beetroot ink, civilian clothing sewn from dyed blankets and stolen German uniforms, maps drawn from memory and smuggled photographs. Over 600 prisoners contributed to the effort, though only 200 would attempt the escape itself. Rollings was assigned to Harry, the tunnel that would ultimately succeed. His role was to work in the dispersal team men who concealed the excavated sand by distributing it in small pouches hidden inside their trousers, scattering it inconspicuously in the compound gardens and beneath barracks. It was tedious, dangerous work. If a pouch tore, if a guard noticed sand trickling from a trouser leg, the entire operation could collapse. But Rollings, whose body still ached from Gestapo torture, never complained. He had learned something in that Charlottenburg basement. Endurance was a form of victory. Survival, even silent survival, was resistance. By March 1944, Harry was complete. The tunnel stretched 336 feet, exiting just beyond the tree line north of the camp. The escape was scheduled for the night of March 24, chosen for its new moon maximum darkness. Rollings was selected as number 41 inches, the escape order, a position determined by his language skills and physical condition. Those who had contributed most to the tunnel's construction went first. Those deemed most likely to evade capture followed. Rollings, still recovering from his injuries, was in the middle tier. The night of March 24 was bitterly cold. Snow fell in thin, dry flakes that melted on contact. At 9:30 p.m., the first man entered Harry's entrance shaft, hidden beneath a stove in Block 104. The plan was for one man to crawl through every few minutes, exiting into the forest where they would disperse in pairs or small groups. But within the first hour, a problem emerged. The tunnel exit had fallen short. Instead of emerging in the forest, it opened in the cleared space just before the tree line, in full view of a guard tower. The margin for error had evaporated. Rollings entered the tunnel at 11:47 p.m. The passage was barely 2 feet high and 2 feet wide, lit by dim fat lamps that cast flickering shadows. The air was thick and stale, smelling of damp earth and sweat. Crawling forward on his belly, Rollings felt his broken ribs grinding with each movement. The walls seemed to press inward. The ceiling dripped cold water down his neck. Every few meters the tunnel dipped or curved, and he had to wriggle blindly forward, trusting the ropes and wooden supports to hold. Claustrophobia clawed at the edges of his mind. He began to hum softly. "It's a long way to Tipperary, not for defiance now, but for comfort." The melody anchored him. It reminded him that he was still human, still capable of creating something beautiful even in darkness. It took 40 minutes to traverse the tunnel. When Rollings finally reached the exit shaft, a hand grabbed his collar and hauled him upward. He emerged into freezing night air, gasping. A fellow prisoner hissed, "Move! To the trees!" Rollings stumbled forward, his legs numb from the crawl, and collapsed into the snow just inside the tree line. Behind him, another man emerged, then another. By midnight, 23 prisoners had successfully exited Harry. At 12:55 a.m., a guard conducting a routine patrol noticed movement near the tunnel exit. He fired a warning shot. Floodlights erupted across the compound. Sirens wailed. The great escape was over. Of the 76 men who had crawled through Harry that night, only 3 would successfully reach neutral territory. 50 would be executed by the Gestapo on Hitler's direct orders. 23, including Charles Rollings, would evade immediate capture. Rollings and 2 others, Flight Lieutenant Ian MacLeod and Pilot Officer Daniel Freeman, fled northeast, moving through dense pine forest toward the rail lines connecting Sagan to Breslau. They had forged travel papers, identifying them as French labourers en route to a work camp. They had civilian clothes sewn from dyed RAF uniforms. They had maps memorised from smuggled atlases. And they had a single tin of corned beef, stolen from a Red Cross parcel, which they agreed to ration over 3 days. The first 24 hours were the most dangerous. Luftwaffe search parties scoured the countryside with dogs and local police. The fugitives moved only at night, hiding during daylight in barns, drainage ditches, and abandoned buildings. On the second night, they reached a rail depot outside Kolfurt. Freeman, who spoke passable German, purchased 3 tickets to Breslau using Reichsmarks forged by the camp's counterfeiting team. The ticket clerk barely glanced at their papers. The train was crowded with soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. Rollings sat pressed against a window, his heart hammering, while a Wehrmacht corporal across from him complained about the cold in Smolensk. MacLeod feigned sleep. Freeman stared at his boots. The journey lasted 4 hours. No one questioned them. In Breslau, they abandoned the train and headed south on foot, aiming for the Czech border 50 miles away. The landscape shifted from flat farmland to rolling foothills. Villages grew sparser. The cold intensified. On the 4th night, Freeman developed frostbite in his toes. On the 5th, they finished the corned beef. On the 6th, MacLeod twisted his ankle crossing a frozen stream. Yet they continued. What sustained them, more than food or warmth, was the knowledge that every mile they covered was a mile beyond the Gestapo's reach. Every hour of freedom was an hour won. Rollings thought often of Heinz, the interrogator, and his prediction. You will die here, and no one will remember your name. With each step, Rollings proved him wrong. On March 31, 1 week after the escape, the 3 men crossed into Czechoslovakia. They made contact with a partisan cell operating in the Sudeten Mountains, who hid them in a farmhouse cellar while arrangements were made to smuggle them south toward Yugoslavia. From there, they would link up with partisan forces fighting the Axis occupation, eventually being evacuated by Allied aircraft. The journey would take another 4 months. But on that April morning in a Czech cellar, eating bread and cheese provided by strangers who risked their lives to shelter them, Charles Rollings allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He had survived. He had escaped. And though he did not yet know it, his story would become legend. The symbolic object that haunts this narrative is song not as entertainment, but as a weapon of the soul. In Gestapo, basements and prison tunnels, in boxcars and forests, Charles Rollings sang. He sang because it was the one thing his captors could not take. They could break his bones. They could forge his wife's voice into a tool of psychological torment. They could strip him of rank, of dignity, of hope. But they could not silence the melody. In totalitarian regimes, uniformity is power. Individuality is threat. A man who sings in defiance, not for an audience, not for effect, but simply because he chooses to embody a freedom that no state apparatus can fully suppress. The Nazis understood this instinctively, which is why Heinz reacted with such fury to Rollings' humming. It was not the volume of the act that mattered. It was the autonomy. It was the refusal to be reduced to mere subject. The Great Escape resulted in 50 executions, a war crime that would later be prosecuted at Nuremberg. But those 50 men did not die in vain. Their deaths galvanized Allied resolve and exposed the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. The 3 men who reached freedom, Rollings, MacLeod, Freeman, carried their story back to England, where it was documented, publicized, and enshrined in military history. Roger Bushell, Big X, was among those executed. His final words, according to witnesses, were, "We made it damn hard for them." And indeed, they had. The Gestapo had to divert thousands of soldiers, police, and Luftwaffe personnel to recapture 76 prisoners. For weeks, Germany's internal security apparatus was paralyzed by the hunt. In a total war, this was no small victory. Charles Rollings returned to England in August 1944, shortly after D-Day. He was promoted to squadron leader and awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his actions during captivity. He never flew combat missions again. His injuries were too severe. Instead, he became an instructor, training young pilots in survival and evasion techniques. In lectures, he rarely spoke of the torture. He rarely spoke of the tunnel. But he always ended with the same advice. Find something they cannot take. A song, a memory, a scrap of dignity. Hold on to it. That is your weapon. After the war, Rollings married his wife Margaret, whose voice had been weaponized against him, and they raised 3 children in Yorkshire. He worked as a school teacher, teaching history and music. He led the church choir. He joined the Royal British Legion and marched in Remembrance Day parades. He lived quietly, deliberately, as if determined to reclaim the ordinary life the war had tried to steal. He died in 1998, at the age of 81, surrounded by family. His obituary mentioned the escape. It mentioned the DSO. But it could not, capture the full measure of what he had done. How do you quantify the value of a man who refused to be broken? How do you measure the impact of a song sung in darkness? The Nazis believed that power flowed from the will of the state, that individuals were interchangeable units to be mobilized or discarded. Democracy, in their eyes, was weakness, a system that allowed men to pursue happiness rather than glory, comfort rather than conquest. And yet, time and again, they encountered men like Rawlings, who embodied a paradox: softness that concealed steel, individualism that generated collective strength. The American GIs who stormed Normandy were not Spartans. The RAF pilots who defended Britain were not samurai. They were clerks and farmers, teachers and factory workers, men who preferred jazz to marching songs and laughter to discipline. And yet they fought with a ferocity that totalitarianism could not match, because they fought for something worth returning to. Freedom is not merely the absence of oppression, it is the presence of possibility. It is the right to sing, to dream, to resist. It is the stubborn insistence that no state, no matter how powerful, owns the human soul. In the end, Charles Rawlings did not defeat the Third Reich alone. That victory required millions of soldiers, billions of dollars, and oceans of blood. But in his own small, defiant way, he illustrated why the Reich was always doomed to fail. You cannot build an empire on fear alone. You cannot sustain conquest without consent, and you cannot extinguish the spark of individual dignity, no matter how many basements you build, how many truncheons you wield, how many voices you twist into weapons. There will always be a man in a cell, humming a half-forgotten tune, reminding his captors that humanity endures. There will always be a tunnel, dug with stolen spoons, proving that ingenuity outlasts tyranny. There will always be a story, passed from prisoner to prisoner, generation to generation, whispering the same eternal truth. You cannot conquer what you cannot break. And some things, the most important things, are unbreakable. The snow fell on Sagan that March night in 1944, covering the tracks of escaped prisoners, muffling the sirens, blanketing the world in silence. But beneath the snow, the tunnel remained a monument to human persistence. And in farmhouses and forests, in Czech cellars and Yugoslav mountains, 23 men moved through darkness toward dawn, carrying with them the knowledge that they had done the impossible. They had defied the Reich. They had sung in the face of extinction. They had escaped. And in doing so, they had proven that no wall, no wire, no ideology is stronger than the simple, stubborn will to be free.